Hi, and welcome to, I hope, welcome back to another edition of my Deuze vlog. My name is Mark Deuze. I'm a professor of media studies at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And in this series of interviews, I talk with people in the media industry as well as media scholars from around the world who are active in or advocates of promoting mental and physical health and well-being in creative careers, specifically in the various media industries, in journalism, advertising, film, television, music, social media, and games. And today I'm really excited to have had a chance to talk with Tamir Nadav. Tamir is head of creative at Kokku Games in Brazil, one of the largest game studios in Latin America. Tamir has worked in the industry for pretty much for 2 decades, since graduating from Full Sail University, who has a dedicated games program. Working in various studios, small studios, startup studios, working on indie games, as well as some of the largest studios, Telltale, Disney Interactive, being part of the production of AAA games with massive budgets. The reason why I approached Tamir for this interview was the publication of an essay of his in May 2024, published on the website of Kokku Games, where he analyzed what he saw as the rampant problem of mental health issues in the game industry and pushing for industry change. And Tamir has been a staunch advocate for this issue, speaking out in public, giving interviews, speaking out at conferences, including just before we recorded our interview, he hosted a session on the very topic of health and well-being at Gamescom, a large game industry conference in Latin America, held in Sao Paulo in Brazil. In the interview, we talk about the weird balance between the positivity among game developers when they gather at a conference about their exciting industry and the negativity that they experience online, as well as the way there's reporting on the industry online. We talk about the differences in mentality and culture in different kinds of studios in different parts of the world and how that influences people's health and well-being and happiness on the job. We talk about how destructive it can be if there are mental health policies in place at work, but they're not aligned with a company's culture and with what people are actually experiencing and doing, becoming performative in the process. And of course, we conclude with the all-important realization that the conversation about health and well-being in creative careers shouldn't be just about coping. It should be about mitigating the very circumstances, the structural circumstances that cause people to suffer and not to thrive. Please enjoy our conversation. Please be sure to check out all the other conversations in this series with people from various industries from around the world. And let's start and be part of a global conversation. Thank you. Welcome and thanks, Tamir, for taking the time for doing this. Hey, let's jump right in. You just got back from the Latin American Gamescom conference in Sao Paulo, and you gave a presentation there on surviving burnout and mental health in today's industry. And well, that gets right to the heart of the matter of what we're talking about in this series of interviews, and I know that you've been doing so much on this already. Can you talk a little bit about that session and how it went and the kind of feedback you got and sort of the vibe of the conference around this issue?
Sure. So I would say that I got a lot of praise about the talk. I think it was very well received, but more importantly, people are really happy that someone is talking about this. So, as long as there's a talk about mental health and a talk about burnout, people are really excited about it because, basically, if you work in the industry, this has affected you one way or another. No one's been in the industry, 5, 10, 20 years and unscathed. Like they've gone
Yeah.
through periods of crunch, they've had layoffs, they've had tough times. So everyone has been really happy that people are talking about this now. So for me, that's really motivating to continue.
Hmm.
Um, I think yeah, so people are really receptive. I talk a little bit about, like ways to help yourself, ways to help the company, but more importantly, it's about the signs, and I think that's what resonated really with people that are feeling tired, that are but no, I'm not burnt out. I'm just tired. I'm just a little demotivated. I'm just stressed. But really highlighting that all the things that you're feeling right now, these are key indicators that there's something more going on, and it's not just a matter of getting 8 hours of sleep at night that's going to, you'll be fine the next day, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, in your presentation, one of the things that stood out for me was your emphasis on, and then it aligns with what you're saying about, finally somebody's talking about this, is seeking finding social support groups, and especially among fellow game developers, and like of course attending game jams and conferences like Gamescom and so on, GDC, I'm guessing as well, and other places, but. Um, so what is it about social support groups that for you stands out? Is it simply powerful to just be able to share what you're feeling or what you're going through, or is that something else? What can social support groups do in your mind?
The thing that really gets me about these social groups, going to conferences or having a close group of friends who are, in the industry as well, is that in these settings, there is an overwhelming amount of positivity.
Hmm.
And this contradicts the overwhelming amount of negativity that the day-to-day life of working in the games industry has. So, it's the negativity of poor management, the negativity of stress and crunch and burnt and things like that, the negativity of going online and seeing everybody, insulting your favorite game or telling you that you're an idiot or like
Yeah.
I dedicate a lot of time talking about toxicity because it is absolutely horrible. But when you go to the game conferences in person, people tend to be a lot more positive, whereas online where they could be more anonymous, they're a lot more negative. So
Yeah.
you go to the conferences, everybody is just excited about everything. Oh, look at this. Oh, look at that. Look at that. And so you get this overwhelming sense of positivity and passion, which is
Mm.
what reignites the passion in us to continue to do what we love. Like these are the moments that truly celebrate um, the work that we put into our industry. And having a small social group of other devs who have that same mindset of being positive, of reassuring and supportive helps you also to feel like, okay, no, it's worth it that I'm doing all of this because I met some really great people. We're supporting each other. We're happy. It helps fight back against all of the negativity that you see online and then in the day-to-day struggles of working in the industry.
Now about that positivity, because it's striking what you say, because one of the things that I've been documenting in my research and talking to people in different industries, especially film and television, but other industries as well, is that this, like you said, this overwhelming amount of positivity, or as somebody would tell me in like in film industry events, everybody's bubbly all the time, and
Hmm.
which on the one hand is nice because you're among people that share your passion, your love for telling great stories and creating art and doing all this really wonderful stuff, but there's also like a performative aspect to it. Like you're almost like you're not supposed to say like, but sometimes this work sucks.
Hmm.
And that, so the positivity can both be really inspiring and, like you said, reigniting that, oh yeah, this is why I'm doing this to begin with. And at the
Hmm.
same time, can we be real with each other for a moment? And of course, as you know, much better than I do. I mean, if you constantly perform yourself in a certain way, sooner or later that actually does damage, right? I
Absolutely.
mean, so how do you, I mean, how do you balance the positivity which is inspiring, which with the positivity that actually undermines what people are actually going through?
Sure. So, I think starting to talk about mental health and burnout at these events is a great way of sort of bridging the gap between the reality, and these events.
Yeah, yeah.
But you could say the same thing about the day-to-day work in the industry or going on. If you go online on any social media, it will make you feel like the reality is the worst possible thing ever every single day, and everybody hates your game, and everybody hates your work, and God forbid you're a female or non-heterosexual, then it's the death threats and the assault threats and things like that.
Mm.
So that's an extreme. But that extreme we see every day. And then you go to these events and you have the other extreme where everybody who's going is excited about being there and meeting new clients or seeing new games or wearing their famous or their new cosplay or whatever. Everybody is going there already excited and happy. So it's not fake. It's a great way of getting everyone in the room at the same time who's there that are in a moment of elation, of happiness. Um, so if a conference lasted for a month, I think that people would start to crack and it would get pretty toxic pretty quickly. But for a couple of days, it's really just a perfect combination of everybody being really excited about the new stuff that the industry is going to offer, or seeing friends that they only spoke to online, or all of these things, and it allows it to be positive without being toxic positivity.
Right.
So I think that really helps. However, a great way to keep it real is this is a really great time to start talking about the problems with mental health and burnout because people are more receptive and they feel like they can do something about it. When you're in a positive environment, you have the ability to make change. When you're exhausted and you're not sleeping and you can't even play a video game, you don't have the energy to make changes. So talking about burnout and mental health at that time, it's good to know, but people are like, well, what am I going to do? I can't, I can barely make a sandwich. So if you talk to them at
Yeah.
the right time, and I think that
Yeah.
there people are more receptive, like I mentioned, during these events, and that where so hopefully I can make more of a difference by talking about it more at more events.
Um, I mean, these events are like you say and like you argue, incredibly important for feeling part of a community and yeah, getting re-inspired and everything. And I mean, you've been going through to them for quite a while. I mean, I think this year you're celebrating your 2 decades in the games industry.
It's
Something like
about
that.
that, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, I love that on your website you talk about yourself as the game industry veteran, right? And also an acknowledgement that a lot of people don't make it that far, right? I mean, I want to ask you a little bit about your career because I
Hmm.
mean, you've done some amazing work, but you're also in a really unique position, not just because of the longevity of your work, but also, I mean, you've done both indie startup studio work as well as like massive, big product like Disney Interactive or Telltale
Hmm.
and so on. And now you're in Brazil at Kokku. I mean, in a position to help a lot of other studios. Um, is there any meaningful difference between, small studio, big studio, between indie, scraping by or having a big budget, the kind of client that you work with? I mean, when it comes to healthy working practices and the conversation around it.
So I would say that indie studios tend to go through more crunch simply because their resources are a lot more
Mm.
constrained. But the difference is when you're an indie studio of like 5, 8 people, chances are everybody's crunching, everybody's doing something, okay, we're going to get through this together, we're going to ship our game, things like that.
Mm.
When you start hitting studios of, 50, 80, 200, 2,000, chances are the people that are crunching are, the junior to senior artists and programmers and things like that. Upper management is probably not there with you. And so there's a lot of expectations set from people who are not necessarily the ones doing the work. And that can make things really tough for morale on the employee side. Um, And shoot, I had one other point. Um, I think that it's I th I think that people who are working at these AAA studios a lot of times feel like they're not being heard by upper management. The
Mm.
other problem is like especially in these larger companies that have been around for a while, the people that are driving these decisions are normally not, the creative leads or the engineering leads. It's shareholders. And
Mm.
shareholders are deciding we need one new game a year and it needs to be bigger than the game last year, but we don't want to hire new people because it doesn't fit with our budget projection. Um and then when the miracle occurs and the team is actually able to pull this off after considerable amount of stress and changing priorities and things like that, the ones that really benefit are the shareholders, and the ones who did all that work, they get a pizza party. And so so the bigger studios, especially the ones that are driven by shareholders, really, really take advantage of the passion and the work from the team. So for us, it helps a bit because we come in and we sort of absolve some of that sort of extra work at a lower price, but still maintaining super high quality. And it helps, ideally, it helps the client take care of their own, while we're able to do, what we do. But the more driving the more ownership that shareholders are, the people who are not actually the ones making the game, or may not even be interested in games at all, are driving, these decisions, the harder it tends to be on the employees. Whereas indie studios generally don't have that. Even if they have a publisher, the publisher's like, okay, you're an indie studio, there's only so much we can do. Just we'll help guide you and support you, but get the game out and then, everybody, makes some money.
Another unusual aspect of your career is that, of course, you started in your home country in North America, in the US,
Mhm.
and now you're in Latin America, in Brazil. Any meaningful difference between, how the studios operate, or how people talk to each other, or what's considered normal and what's considered anything that makes sense in terms of that distinction to you?
Sure. So I also spent some time working in Canada, but it's so
Right.
close to the United States, it's not really worth diving into. Brazil is a very different beast.
Hmm.
Um, One of the biggest differences is the sheer amount of worker protections that exist in the country
Ah.
by law. So, for example, in the United States, you have X amount of vacation to take per year, but there's a number of ways to give employees infinite vacation, but only with management approval, which means nobody takes vacation. In Brazil, you have 30 days guaranteed, and one of those periods that you take has to be at least 15 days long
Hmm.
every year. And if you do not, the company is heavily liable. So the company forces you to take those vacations. That's a really, really great example of the differences that laws for worker protections can make.
Right.
So I'm on vacation right now, actually, for 2 weeks, because if I didn't take my vacation by June, there was going to be a big scandal. So HR made me take vacation.
Hmm.
Um, and for me, coming from the United States, my first few vacations in Brazil, I didn't know what to do because like I've never took vacation. Like this is crazy. So this is one example of the massive differences. Another one that I think is really, really important is not per the law, it's just by culture. And I could make a dissertation about this, but the culture in Brazil is a lot more group oriented, not individual oriented. Whereas in America, it's very isolated. People have their bubbles. People, have their own individualism. Like that's the thing in America is individualism. In Brazil, it's all about the group mentality. So, you in America, you build your reputation based on your accomplishments, on your merit. In Brazil, your reputation is based on your relationships with your peers and upper management.
Ah.
So people will trust you more if they get to know you, if you've had some beers together, if, things like that. And your colleagues identify, like everybody wants to be friends with everybody because there's an understanding in Brazil, we can't do this alone. You can't survive on your own. It doesn't matter if you're in games or working in the grocery store or in a bank or whatever. You need people because like Brazil is a very group oriented society. And now you need people in America as well. We just don't like to think about that. We like to pretend we did everything on our own. So these two massive differences, like all of the laws that are protecting employees in Brazil, and the very different culture about group-oriented people, make a massive difference in the way that you interact with your work. And for me, being in Brazil, it is a heck of a lot more healthy. Maybe that's just my personality. I thrive much better when I feel like I'm a part in a group. But I see the differences in the way that people react to that respond to their work based on these laws and regulations, and on just the way that the culture works.
That sounds wonderfully healthy. um,
Yeah.
um, but I do, and this is not to challenge that, but I wonder what your perspective on this. I remember from going to the game developers conference and talking to developers over there. Also, people who were specifically charged with sort of improving the quality of life at the studio or something like that. That they would say, "Look, we sometimes come up with these policies, like for example, everybody at 5 p.m. out of the door, like go home, go to your
Hmm.
partner, go see your kids, right?" And or doing those kind of things. But he said, but often that doesn't really work because the people in the company are so obsessive slash passionate about what they're doing. Yeah, we might send them home, but then they can continue work at home on their computers and then bringing their shitty software back into the studio the next day, and we have a whole new set of problems on our hands. Well, I mean, that's a silly anecdote, but I guess the point that I'm making is, and it relates to, I think, a point you made at your presentation at the conference, is how do we help people in the industry to take care of themselves? Like to set their own boundaries. I mean, it's beautiful if we have good policies in place and a healthy working culture, as you say. But then there's also still the individual who's passionate and they overwhelmingly young and excited and they have no boundaries yet. How do you stimulate that in a studio environment?
Yeah, so it's easier in countries that the culture is already set that way, that job is just a job.
Right.
You go, after you work, you go home, you hang out with your friends. Like it's a lot easier to manage it that way. The problem with, for example, the anecdote you just shared about, management, okay, 5 o'clock, computers get locked, everybody go home, is that is one performative example, but it doesn't
Mhm.
reflect the culture of the studio.
Yeah.
So, for example, in that case, management may still start sending emails 7, 8, 9 p.m., saying, hey, what about this? What about this? Are you thinking about this? Whatever. And they are creating this culture that, sure, even though employees went home, they're still expected to be responding to messages. So it's very performative. And I see that, in a number of ways. The pizza party thing, where, the company spends $200 to reward employees for basically donating hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of effort and extra overtime and things like that. So if you have a studio of 100 people and everybody donates 1 extra hour, a pizza party is 2% of what you've gotten from your employees. And
Right.
so by not paying that overtime. And so these are things where if you're going to have a culture about healthy, about being healthy and taking care of yourselves and doing things the quote unquote the right way, it needs to be in every aspect of the way that you work. Otherwise, it's just seen as performative, that it's just for show. It's just so we can check a box and make interviews talking about how healthy we are, but the reality is different. A really good example of this is I worked at a place where they had a policy of no overtime.
Hmm.
So that, no matter what, you can't work, overtime, and we had to log our hours. The reality is people were pushed to basically to donate time to mark that they were checking out, but then still finishing work outside of that, even though they had logged out.
Right.
Because if they had logged that they worked overtime, then there's a big problem, and oh, we don't have overtime here, blah blah blah. But the reality is they are being pressured to work overtime regardless. And so if it's um it's really important to maintain that, are we going to be a healthy company or not? And own it, like know what you're deciding, and know what you're doing. Because when you do these things that are great for articles and publicity, but the reality is very different, employees are going to be encouraged to speak their opinion. Although usually that doesn't happen because they're so afraid about losing their job. It just makes them feel worse because they're just going to continue to be clocking this overtime, but not getting paid for it, and feel taken advantage of and miserable. And that no matter where they go in the industry, it's going to be the same thing. So why bother changing?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a powerful observation. I mean, and something that resonates with a lot of research in other industries where, like in advertising, a lot of research shows that all these agencies make public statements on their websites and everything, like we are a family.
Hmm.
And then when in surveys, the workers, the creatives or whatever, they actually say, yeah, but these are just box ticking exercises.
Yep.
Like this has no relation to the work we're actually supposed to be doing here, which is set to unrealistic expectations and all that. So that really relates to what you're saying. Now, one of the many reasons that I wanted to talk to you and that I'm so grateful for your time is an an essay that you published last year on the website of Kokku Games on in May last year, where you talked about mental health challenges in the industry and how things could change or could be changing. And one of the things she said, I just wanted to ask, we're a year on from that post. I mean, you like you speak at conferences about it. You're an advocate. It's see what your thoughts on what is happening in the industry and if anything is changing. Maybe not from 1 year ago, but in
Hmm.
general, if something is might be changing. You wrote in that essay how mental health issues are rampant in the
Hmm.
industry, right? Like you said earlier on in our conversation, like everybody at some point has these kinds of experiences. And you wrote employees are pushed down, overworked, underpaid, pushed to the breaking point, and then laid off on what can feel like a whim. And that observation is particularly poignant because last year was a hell of a year when it comes to game industry layoffs. I mean, industry overcorrecting post pandemic. I mean, there's been a bunch of explanations, but the bottom line is exactly what you're saying. It feels like a whim. Like these were people that were also working hard and are
Hmm.
talented and all of that. How do you see that 1 year on? I mean, is there maybe also because of the intensity of those layoffs around the world that something has changed or a growing awareness about we can't keep doing this all the time? Or what is your perspective now?
I think that we are still in the waves of layoffs.
Hmm.
It's still it's still bad. For example, I put together a slide in my talk at Gamescom showcasing, layoffs, and the most recent layoff I had when I put together the slide was April 17th. There were a few hundred people let go from a company. And I submitted the presentation on the 20th. And so, but in between the 17th and when I gave my talk on the 2nd of May, there had been more layoffs.
Uh,
And so like that slide, it's still happening. And every company that is doing this is still rolling with the post-COVID wave. It's still an excuse.
mm.
Like, oh yeah, we grew too big after COVID. It's like you didn't grow until after COVID. You can't use this excuse anymore. But a lot of these things are being driven by shareholders. And one of the most depressing stories that I saw was a studio that won significant amounts of awards for the game that they released, and then their project was cut, and then their team was cut, and everybody got laid off. And later that week, that company made, oh yeah, we've decided we only want to focus on making award-winning games. And the creator of that game took a picture of all of the awards on his shelf and said, "You mean like this?" I mean, it was a great response, but the reality is, we're still being driven by people who are not part of the gaming community, by these shareholders, and also by people who are just driven by the financial response. So it doesn't matter if you make an award-winning, billion-dollar revenue generating game or not. The moment the game is released and out into the public, the people who are still there are liabilities,
Mm.
and they affect the profit margin. So if it takes 400 people to release a game, and it takes 100 people to keep the content for that game going, the game goes live, it wins a billion awards, and then 300 people lose their jobs for COVID. And then that 100 people is meant to just keep the game running. And the worst part about it is they use this to show how profitable the game is, because they're not showing just the money generated by the game. They're showing the profit. So that means that value is taking into account all of the salaries that are no longer being paid.
Mm.
And so it's a way of inflating the success of an already successful product, at the expense of the 300 people that are now looking for work, along with the other 50,000 people that have been laid off in the past few years.
How does how because I mean, yeah, last year, this year are particularly horrendous years in terms of game industry layoffs around the world. But one thing that has always struck me about employment in the game industry, that while relatively speaking, most people in the game industry actually, when they work in a studio, they have a permanent contract. So the industry relies less on freelancing than other industries do, even though they still exist, of course. But that
Hmm.
doesn't seem to matter any much because of all these layoffs happening all the time. So people get hired and fired in a fairly rapid pace. Um, and because it relates to something you wrote in that blog post as well, is that um, it preys on what you call the love that people have for this industry. And it's sort of like, so how do these inevitable experiences of being hired and fired? I mean, I remember seeing a blog post of a Reddit post by one game developer who was hired and then fired 2 weeks before he was supposed to start. It's like
Hmm.
he said, so this is the contemporary game industry career, I guess. Um, how does that, do you see that affecting people's love for the industry, or is that passion so strong that they just, well, I guess that's part of the game, how does that changing perhaps?
People react in very different ways to these sorts of traumatic events. I see a
Mm.
lot of people becoming bitter, and I don't blame them.
Mhm.
Cynical, don't blame them, and even toxic. Like they do the job, but they're always miserable. They know that everything is eventually going to collapse anyway. They do the bare minimum, but they still love games, and so it's almost like if somebody was poisoning your favorite food, just a little every day.
Mm.
So, like you really love pizza, and every time you eat pizza, your body reacts horribly. But you still love pizza, and it's almost worth it, just to have the pizza, but it's awful. Um, it feels a lot like that. And so like I'm a person who, when I get is people know when I get burnt out or tired or stressed, because I'm generally an extremely bouncy, optimistic, positive person. And when I'm just super apathetic, it's like, okay, he needs a break. And they're like, whatever. You know. Um, so the trick is to try and focus on the things that you love. If you can take a break, take a break. Like, if you get hired and then fired before you even start, hopefully there was some severance involved, but probably not. Um, anything that they can do if they have the time to just take a breath and relax. But for me, it's very important to remember that as much as I love working on games, it is still a job. It is just a job. And my real priorities are, my family, my friends, my health, and I will do better at my job if I take care of these other things, because I will be at my desk, working my 9 to 6, but in a healthier state. And these other things basically help me. It's basically transferring passion for the games industry back into a bit more of a healthier passion for living.
Mm.
And that's, I think, the difference. Like, I have a lot of passion for the games industry. I wouldn't be going to these events if I didn't. I'm obviously wearing a big nerdy t-shirt here. Um, but um, but it's really important to remember that I am not just my job. I have a family. I have my friends. I have my health. these sorts of things. And the more I spend time focusing on trying to take care of those other things, the more I tend to find that I have energy to combat, the chaos of the games industry.
Yeah, it's such a powerful. It reminds me of there's this film, Australian film that was made about this topic, but specifically to the Australian film and television industry. And there's a an interview in the film with Sam Neill, the famous actor,
Oh, I
and
love him.
he and they are and because he speaks quite openly about his struggles with health and at work, and they asked him, so how did you learn to cope with all of this? And he said, well, I realized that this is not who I am. This is what I do. And that really relates to what you're saying. That's a very
Yeah,
powerful point. Um,
absolutely.
um, I mean, you're working now at one of the, if not the largest game companies in Brazil, in Latin America even. And Kokku has its own set of policies in place to engage with this. I mean, you offer an online service, I think, for therapy sessions
Yeah.
for your colleagues. Can you talk a little bit about how Kokku sort of takes responsibility in this space?
Sure. So, there are good times and bad times, but what I see is which makes me really, really happy is the desire to take care of our people,
Right.
and that comes from the CEO all the way down. So that for me, um, the fact that he has that amount of care for his people, it speaks volumes because many CEOs do not. They see people as dollar signs, and that's it. Our head of HR is also a person that I see with a passion for taking care of people. Whereas in many companies I've worked, the head of HR is dedicated solely to protecting the interests of the executives, and I've had some pretty horrible experiences in the past because of that.
Mm.
But with these two driving forces to take care of the team, we keep adding benefits here and there. We keep making our benefits better. We have online. Um, I guess training sessions to talk about all the various benefits that we have to help take care of people. And I see a lot of people taking advantage of it. Normally, maybe it's an American thing, maybe I don't know, but I would see like, oh, hey, we have free therapy, whatever. Nobody uses it. But here I see more and more people taking advantage of this, and I think that's a really, really good sign that the people feel comfortable enough to try this thing. Therapy has its own stigma, unfortunately, but I think it's incredibly important. I definitely would not be here if it wasn't for therapy. And so I'm glad to see that people are starting to take advantage of these things. If it's free, that's always a good thing, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned stigma, and you said at the beginning of our conversation about also about Gamescom that if anything, talking about mental health is appreciated by a lot of people simply for that fact that it's being talked about. That makes and this is something that runs throughout all these creative industries, right? I mean, taboo, stigma. I mean, what are some of the ways in which we can or you can normalize this conversation? I mean, I'm guessing doing stuff like this and posting on, a blog on this and speaking at conferences. Um, I mean, from your vantage point in the industry, is this something that is actually, like you said, sessions are being booked at conferences for this topic? Is that a new thing, or has that been going on for a while, or?
I'd say it's newer. There's probably one or two people per conference that talks about it, but when that goes from two to five or to 10, I mean, obviously not taking over the whole conference, but more
Yeah.
people talking about how to mitigate, not just how to cope. Actually, I think that's the biggest difference. In the past is how to cope with crunch, how to cope with overtime, how to cope with the layoffs, the craziness, the things that you see in the industry. Now we're starting to talk about no, I shouldn't just only have to cope. How do I make this not happen? And
Mm,
so how do I make myself better? How do I reduce the amount of chance that something like this is going to happen? So the more that we talk about moving away from just surviving, even though I know I just talked about survival, but the more we move away from survival and towards change,
mm,
um, and the more that people are talking about it, the more normal it becomes. It's still, a new topic, and people are very cynical. They think, oh yeah, how to remove crunch from your studio. Like, nobody's going to believe that.
Mm.
Because it takes a lot of work and a lot of, planning and capital and stuff. But as we move more towards to an acceptance that we don't need to take this. Like, we should not accept this as the normal. We can fight against this. Then people will start being moved to do more. I know that there's a global game union that just got started, I think last year.
Mhm.
And I'd love to see what's going to happen with that, and whether or not it's going to help people in various places start to change the way that we work, and the way that we tolerate mismanagement of people.
That's and that really inspired me originally about when I saw your post and about our conversation in the past and what you're saying now is that despite all of this and despite the reality and like the numbers of layoffs and people saying that crunch is still a part of their work, unfortunately. You seem staunchly optimistic about the possibility of change. I mean, going back to that original essay of yours, you say to fight back starts with employees demanding change, then companies responding, and in time we can have a truly safe and healthy industry. And you mentioned at your Gamescom talk last week something similar about that, we need to push for industry change. I mean, on the one hand, we can say, well, a bunch of individual workers are not going to change an entire industry. On the other hand, I think you need to have that belief that if you stand up for yourself and for your community, your group, or your team, that it can make a difference, and that will sort of ideally have a snowball effect. Do you see still like is your vantage point still sort of this push towards a truly safe and healthy industry? Do you see that happening?
I do. And I even though like the news gets flooded with layoffs and things like that, if you look, there are articles about companies that are doing things, in my opinion, the right way, about grand successes when they reduced to a 4-day work week, or when they do these various things. And the nice thing is that, I would love to get more articles and more coverage on these things, but they show that there's money to be made by doing it the right way.
Mm,
And so when that starts becoming a bigger topic, then the money people want to do that, because, like, oh, hey, I could save, 15% on developing this massive game if I do this thing. That sounds great. Let's do that thing. And that thing is also beneficial for employees, even better. As far as more employees demanding change, I think that that is the right way to go. I'm not going to move the needle of the industry, but if I can help a couple people be better, and then they help a couple people, and they help little by little, this wave and this energy will make a difference. Now, I'm in a situation where I'm a head of two departments, and so I directly affect the lives of 60 people.
mm.
And so by me having these ideas on how to take care of people, and the importance of taking care of people, hopefully these 60 people feel a heck of a lot better working for me than maybe other managers that they've had in the past. They feel respected, they feel trusted, they feel like somebody's looking out for them. And so if I can help other managers feel, take the same approach that I do, that may, have a bigger effect. And so I think it's really, really important for me, someone in a leadership position, to be vocally advocating for the health and safety of the individual workers. And as more, lead heads and executives start to talk about this, that will have a much bigger impact.
Well, thanks again for. I mean, you know what? I totally share your optimism. I mean, the one thing that when I talk about my research and people say, "Oh, this is so depressing," I say, "Yeah, but you're forgetting that all of this stuff comes from the industry itself."
Hmm.
So that means that this is an active conversation and it has to go somewhere. I mean, it can't go back to what it was. I mean, people won't, yeah, they won't accept that. So I mean, to me, that's really, and yeah, to quote you, empowering that idea. And so, thank you so much for taking the time today, for speaking out at Gamescom and at the company website. And yeah, well, let's continue the conversation.
Absolutely. I'm really passionate about this topic, especially because I see it helping people. Like, every time I do a talk, every time I do an interview, one person will thank me and say, "Oh, I really needed to hear that." And like, I mean, that's amazing. And so
Wow. Yeah.
little by little, I'm making a difference, and that's all I want. So
Excellent.